The American soldiers arrived at the signal station outside Bizerte on a Tuesday morning in May 1943, and the first thing they did was nothing. No shooting, no shouting. They simply stopped their vehicles at the perimeter, stepped out, and waited. Greta Hoffmann watched them from the window of the communications hut, with her hand pressed flat against the wall, and her heart doing something irregular that she didn't have a medical word for. She was 24 years old, from Hamburg, a radio operator who had spent 2 years in North Africa, sending and receiving coded messages for the Luftwaffe Signals Corps. She had spent the last 3 days watching the German lines collapse around her unit, like a building whose foundation had been quietly removed, while everyone was looking elsewhere. Liesl Bauer stood beside her. She was 19, from a farming village in Bavaria, and she had joined the Signals Corps the previous year because there was no work at home, and the government needed women who could type. She had learned to type. She had been sent here. She had never entirely understood how those two facts connected. Behind them both, Magda Schneider sat at the communications desk with her hands folded in her lap, and her face arranged into the particular stillness she used when she was thinking hard and didn't want anyone to know it. She was 31, from Berlin, university educated, fluent in 3 languages, senior enough in rank to have understood for months that the war in North Africa was ending and not in Germany's favor. She had kept that understanding to herself, because saying it out loud would have been dangerous. The German commander had given them instructions before he left. He had left quickly in the early hours before dawn, with the other officers in the remaining vehicle. His instructions were the standard ones issued to women's auxiliary units facing capture. Destroy all equipment. Resist. Fight to the death if necessary. What the enemy would do to them if captured was not stated explicitly, but the implication was thorough and detailed and designed to make death seem preferable. They had destroyed the equipment. They had not fought to the death, because there was nothing to fight with and nowhere to fight toward. 847 women stood in the morning sun with their hands visible, watching American soldiers approach across the sand, and waited to find out whether the propaganda was accurate. The Americans processed them with the efficient impersonality of people managing a large, complicated task under time pressure. Names, ranks, unit designations, all recorded by clerks with clipboards who asked questions in English and waited for the interpreter to translate, then wrote down the answers without apparent interest in the human beings producing them. It was not warm. It was not cruel. It was bureaucratic, which was somehow more disorienting than either warmth or cruelty would have been. Greta had expected violence first. The propaganda had been specific about this. The Americans were undisciplined, impulsive, driven by appetite rather than order. They would not wait for processing. They would not use clipboards. What she was watching bore no resemblance to what she had been told to watch for, and the gap between the two was wide enough to make her question the instrument she was using to measure it. They were taken to a holding camp outside the city. A large field surrounded by wire, divided into sections, run with the same impersonal efficiency as the initial processing. Medical officers moved through the women checking for injuries and illness. An American doctor paused at Greta's hands, sand-cracked, thin from months of inadequate rations, and said something to his assistant that the interpreter rendered as, "She needs food and rest. Note the malnutrition." Note the malnutrition, not as a judgment. As a clinical observation, the way you note a crack in a structural wall, factually, without drama, because the fact is what matters, and the appropriate response is repair rather than commentary. Greta had been malnourished for the better part of a year. No one in the German army had noted it. That evening, food was distributed. White bread, soft and real. Canned meat. Coffee that smelled like actual coffee. Liesl ate her portion in small, careful bites, the way you eat when you are afraid the supply is temporary, and speed will only make the ending arrive sooner. Magda ate slowly and watched everything with the expression she used when she was cataloging information she didn't yet know what to do with. At night in the holding area, the women whispered. Some insisted the kindness was tactical, a softening before the real treatment began, a way to lower defenses before applying pressure. Others were quieter, sitting with the evidence of the day against the evidence of their training, trying to find the configuration in which both could be true. Greta lay on her blanket and thought about her fiancé, somewhere in the Atlantic on a submarine, unreachable, possibly already gone. She thought about her mother in Hamburg. She thought about the American doctor who had noted her malnutrition, as though it were something that deserved to be corrected. She did not sleep for a long time, but when she did, she slept on a blanket that smelled of soap, in a field that was not being bombed, with a stomach that was not empty. That was more than she had been able to say for months. 3 weeks later, the announcement came. They would be transported by ship across the Atlantic. Their destination was America. None of the 847 women had ever been there. They knew it only from propaganda newsreels. A country of excess and moral weakness, of jazz music and skyscrapers and people who had never been tested by real hardship, and therefore could not be trusted to behave correctly when things became difficult. Magda, upon hearing the destination, wrote one sentence in her small notebook and underlined it twice. She did not show it to anyone. Later, much later, Greta would ask her what it said. "I wonder if anything we were taught is true," Magda had written. "I am going to find out." The ship was larger than any building Greta had ever stood inside. A converted passenger liner, repurposed for the war, but still carrying the structural memory of a vessel designed to carry people across oceans in conditions of reasonable comfort. She had expected the cargo hold. She had prepared herself mentally for the cargo hold. The darkness, the chains, the conditions appropriate to how she assumed the Americans thought of their prisoners. A sailor led her and Liesel and Magda down a corridor and stopped at a cabin door. Inside, 4 bunks with mattresses. Real mattresses, with springs, covered in sheets that had been laundered. A small sink with a tap. A porthole admitting a rectangle of gray Atlantic light. Liesel touched the mattress with 2 fingers, as if verifying its reality through contact. She had been sleeping on packed sand for 6 months. The mattress gave slightly under her fingers. She sat down on it, slowly, and looked at Greta with an expression that had no name in any of the 3 languages Magda spoke. That first evening, sailors led them to the dining area. The smell reached Greta before the room did. Bread, real bread, and something else she identified after a moment as actual coffee, not the burned grain substitute that had been standard issue for the last year. She stood in the doorway of the dining room and breathed it in before she entered. Her tray held white bread with butter, fish with boiled potatoes, canned fruit, and a cup of coffee. She counted the calories out of professional habit. The habit of a woman who had spent months calculating exactly how much her body could do, on exactly how little fuel. The number she arrived at was more than twice what she had been consuming daily for the past 4 months. Liesel ate slowly and said very little. At the next table, 2 American sailors were complaining about the food. One of them gestured at his tray with evident dissatisfaction. The interpreter, seated nearby, provided the translation without being asked. "He says it's the same thing every day." Getting boring. Liesel set down her fork. She looked at her tray. She looked at the sailor. She picked up her fork again and said nothing, but something shifted in her face. Some final foundational assumption giving way quietly. The way ice gives way in spring, not with drama, but with the inevitability of something that was always going to happen once the temperature changed. The ship sailed for 3 weeks. 3 meals a day, every day. Clean beds every night. American guards who did their jobs without apparent interest in making the job unpleasant for anyone. Magda wrote in her notebook every evening. She was counting and measuring and tracking. The boots on the guards, which were leather and whole, and showed no signs of the improvised repair work that had become standard on German military footwear by 1943. The medical supplies available in the ship's infirmary, which she glimpsed through an open door, and which represented more than their entire field station in Tunisia had possessed at any point in the previous year. The food, always the food. Its quantity, its quality, the casualness with which it was produced and distributed, as if abundance were simply the baseline expectation rather than an achievement requiring sacrifice and careful management. On the final day before they reached port, Magda showed Greta her notebook. Not the writing, the numbers. Columns of figures, careful estimates. The arithmetic of a woman who had been taught that the enemy was weak and starving, and was finding, calculation by calculation, that the numbers did not support the lesson. "This is not a country that is losing," Magda said quietly. "No," Greta agreed. "Then what are we?" Greta looked out the porthole at the approaching American coastline. Low and green and entirely unbombed. Cities visible in the distance with their lights on, No blackouts, no fear of what moved through the sky after dark. She didn't answer. The answer was too large and too recent to say out loud. The American coastline grew larger through the porthole until it became specific. A harbor, docks, cranes, buildings standing whole and unhurt against a blue morning sky. Greta watched it the way you watch something you have been told about extensively, and are now seeing for the first time and finding that the description was wrong in every particular. No ruins, no gaps in the skyline where buildings used to be. No smoke. The Port of New York processed them with the same impersonal efficiency that had characterized every American interaction since capture. Clipboards, photographs, numbers on cards. A medical check conducted by a doctor who moved quickly but not roughly, noting conditions, issuing vitamins in small paper cups that several women refused on the assumption that they were sedatives or worse. Greta took hers and swallowed it. She had stopped refusing things on principle. Principle required certainty about what you were refusing, and certainty was something she had less of every day. They were loaded onto trains. Passenger trains with seats and windows and the particular American smell of industrial cleaner and coffee that she was already beginning to associate with captivity, the way the brain associates any recurring sensory detail with the circumstances in which it appears most often. The train moved west. Through the windows, America presented itself without apparent awareness of being observed. Cities gave way to suburbs, suburbs to farmland, farmland to more farmland. Flat, enormous, worked by machinery that Greta had no German equivalent for in terms of scale. Fields of wheat and corn stretched to horizons that seemed further away than horizons had any right to be. Liesl pressed her face to the glass and said nothing for an hour. Towns appeared and disappeared. Each one looked substantially the same from the train window. Main streets with shops, churches with their doors open, people moving about in the unhurried manner of those who had nowhere urgent to be. Nobody looked hungry. Nobody looked frightened. Nobody was looking at the sky. Magda watched it all and wrote in her notebook. May 1943, she wrote. Third day on the train. We have passed through at least 12 towns. None shows bomb damage. None shows rationing queues. The people in the streets appear well fed and normally dressed. The train has not broken down once. The food arrives 3 times a day without variation or shortage. I am running out of ways to explain this as propaganda. On the 4th day, the train slowed. The landscape outside had changed. Flatter, wider, the sky enormous above fields that seemed to go on without the courtesy of ending. A guard moved through the car and said something in English. The interpreter followed behind him. Approaching your destination, he translated. Gather your belongings. Through the window, Greta could see a small station ahead. A water tower, a grain elevator. A main street of perhaps 6 blocks visible from the tracks, brick buildings, a church steeple. The kind of American town she had seen in photographs, modest and orderly and entirely unremarkable. The train stopped. The women filed out onto the platform in the June heat, blinking in the brightness after the dimness of the train car. Greta straightened her uniform out of habit, though the uniform was beyond the help of straightening. She looked around the platform. A man in a neat civilian suit was walking toward them from the station building. He was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with the unhurried stride of someone on his own ground. He stopped in front of the assembled women and opened his mouth. What came out stopped every one of them cold. Willkommen. Ich hoffe, die Reise war nicht zu beschwerlich. Welcome. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult. Not broken German. Not textbook German with the careful, slightly wrong emphasis of someone who learned it from a manual. German with a specific regional texture. Something from the Midwest of Germany itself, Swabian perhaps. The German of someone who had heard it spoken in a kitchen, and a church and around a dinner table for their entire childhood. 847 women stood completely still. Liesel's hand found Greta's arm and gripped it. Magda's head came up sharply, her eyes narrowing with the focused attention of a linguist identifying a specimen. Is this a trick? Liesel whispered in German. A test? Are they trying to catch us saying something we shouldn't? Magda shook her head slowly, still listening, her eyes on the man's face. That is a Swabian accent, she said quietly. Southern Germany, probably 3rd generation. He did not learn that in a classroom. The man continued in German, explaining that he was the town's mayor. that the camp was 3 kilometers outside town, that they would be processed and assigned work details over the coming days. Standard administrative information, delivered in the language of Goethe and Luther and Greta's grandmother's bedtime stories, from the mouth of an American official in an American suit on an American train platform. More people had appeared on the platform while he spoke. Civilians come to watch the arrival. 2 women near a bench were talking to each other, in German. An older man pushing a luggage cart moved past, humming something under his breath that Greta recognized after a moment. A folk song from the Rhine Valley, the same one her father used to sing on Sunday afternoons before the war, made Sunday afternoons feel like a different geological era. Liesel whispered, "Are we in the wrong country? Did the ship take us to Germany by mistake?" She said it without irony, because it was a genuine question arising from genuine confusion, and it deserved a genuine answer. But the signs were in English. The flags were American. The guards wore American uniforms. They were not in Germany. Germany was somewhere across an ocean that was growing larger in the imagination every day. The mayor led them down the main street toward the waiting trucks. Greta walked and looked at everything. A newspaper stand on the corner displayed papers in 2 languages. An English broadsheet on the left, and on the right, a German language weekly whose masthead she read twice to make sure she was reading it correctly. Der Amerikanische Farmer, the American farmer. A German newspaper in America, available on an ordinary street corner next to its English counterpart. A church on the next block had a signboard out front with the Sunday service times, in English and below it in German. 2 languages, side by side, neither one annotated as foreign or exceptional. Both simply present, like 2 equally normal things. Street signs caught her eye as the trucks pulled up. Friedrich Street, Wilhelm Avenue, Schiller Park. German names on American streets, worn smooth by decades of ordinary use, as unremarkable to the people who lived here as the names of their own grandparents. Magda was writing. She had the notebook out before the truck doors closed, her pen moving quickly, recording everything before the impressions could fade. Liesel sat with her hands in her lap and looked at nothing, her face carrying the expression of someone whose internal filing system has received more new information than it was designed to process in a single afternoon. The camp occupied a former agricultural fairground 3 kilometers outside town. Large permanent buildings, wooden barracks constructed more recently, a perimeter fence that was present but not oppressive. An American Army sergeant met them at the gate. He went through the standard arrival procedures in English, waiting for the interpreter. Then a second man stepped forward. He was perhaps 65, small, with white hair and the particular posture of a man who has spent decades standing in front of people and speaking. He introduced himself in German as Pastor Wilhelm Faber, chaplain. His German was Bavarian, specific and warm, the German of the Alpine foothills. Liesel made a small sound that was not quite a word. "You are far from home," the pastor said in German, "but you are not among strangers. Many people in this town speak your language. Many of their grandparents came from the same places you came from. You will find this strange at first. I hope you will find it, eventually, a comfort." He said it without theater, the way you say something that is simply true and requires no decoration. Then he stepped back, and the sergeant resumed the administrative proceedings. They were assigned to barracks, 4 women to a room, bunks with mattresses, wool blankets, a window. Greta sat on her bunk and listened to the sounds of the camp settling into its evening rhythms. Somewhere outside, she could hear voices. American voices speaking English. And beneath them, occasional German. A phrase, a sentence, a burst of laughter in a language that had no business being here, and yet was here, casually and completely, as if it had always been. Dinner was served in the main building. A long room, wooden tables, the smell of actual cooking. Not the institutional minimalism of field rations, but something that had been made with attention. Roast meat, potatoes, bread, vegetables, a cup of real coffee. Greta looked at her plate. She had developed over the previous weeks on the ship a habit of counting before eating. Not from greed, but from the residual anxiety of someone who had spent months managing scarcity and had not yet fully updated the assumption that scarcity was the default state. She counted. The number was, again, more than twice what her body had been given daily for most of the past year. An American woman in an apron moved between the tables, refilling coffee cups without being asked. She stopped at Greta's table and said something in English. Then, noticing the German women's blank expressions, switched without pause into German. "More coffee? I just made a fresh pot." Her German was second generation, fluent but carrying the faint overlay of a life lived primarily in English. The way an instrument sounds when it has been played mostly in one key. Still completely comprehensible. Still German. Greta accepted the coffee. She watched the woman move on to the next table, switching back to English with equal ease. The two languages sitting in her like furniture in a house. Both just there, both simply part of the space. "How?" Liesl said quietly. "Does she just switch like that?" "Practice," Magda said. "Decades of it. Her grandparents probably spoke only German. Her parents probably spoke both. She grew up in both." "Can you do that?" Liesl asked. "Be two things at once?" Magda looked at her coffee cup for a moment. "Apparently," she said, "yes." That night the three women lay in their bunks and did not sleep for a long time. Through the barracks wall they could hear the distant sounds of the town. A car engine, a dog, music from somewhere that might have been a radio. The music was American, but after a while it shifted to something older and slower. An accordion, playing a waltz that Greta recognized from home. "That is impossible," Liesl said from her bunk. "No," Magda said. "That is what happens when people carry their culture across an ocean, and it survives." A pause. "Our culture is over there," Greta said, "being bombed." Nobody answered that. It sat in the dark between them, true and large and requiring no elaboration. The next morning, work assignments were posted. Greta and Liesl were assigned to a food processing plant in town. Magda, on account of her language skills and education, was assigned to the local hospital as a translator. An American corporal named Henderson, a large, amiable man whose German surname sat visibly in his face, would escort them to their first day. Corporal Henderson addressed them in the morning in a mixture of English and German that was startling in its confidence. His German was fragmentary, words and short phrases learned from parents who had learned them from grandparents. But he used it without embarrassment, filling the gaps with English and gesture, and the easy manner of someone who had never been taught that languages were territorial. "My Oma spoke German," he explained, using the German word for grandmother without apparent awareness that he had switched languages mid-sentence. "Good woman, good cook. She'd have fed you better than the army does." He said it as a joke. He did not know, and there was no way to explain to him why Liesl had to look away for a moment after he said it. He did not know about the rations in Tunisia, or the months of thin soup and hard bread, or the German grandmother in Bavaria who had taught Liesl to cook before the war took all the ingredients. He did not know that his casual use of the word Oma had landed in Liesl's chest like something physical. He escorted them to the truck without further conversation, cheerful and unhurried. A man doing an ordinary job on an ordinary morning in a town where German grandmothers and American grandsons coexisted as naturally as the two languages on the newspaper stand. Greta climbed into the truck. Through the window as they pulled out of the camp, she could see the town coming into focus in the early morning light. Solid, unhurried, old in the American way. Not centuries old, but settled. The kind of old that comes from people deciding this is where they will stay and then staying. German names on the storefronts. German words on the church sign. An American flag on every corner. And underneath them, in the ordinary business of an ordinary morning, the German language moving through the streets like something that had always lived here. Because it had. The food processing plant was called Schneider Meats. When Liesl saw the name on the building, she stopped walking for a full 3 seconds. Schneider was a common German name, common enough that half the women in their barracks had known at least one Schneider. But seeing it painted in large letters above an American factory entrance on a Tuesday morning in Indiana produced a disorientation that went beyond the merely linguistic. A woman met them at the entrance. She was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered with flower-white hair pulled back efficiently, and hands that showed decades of physical work. She introduced herself in German as Frau Schmidt, floor supervisor, and shook each woman's hand with the directness of someone who assessed people quickly, and had already made preliminary conclusions. Her German was Hamburg German, specific, particular, the dialect of the port city in northern Germany where Greta had grown up. The German of her father's shop and her mother's kitchen, and every ordinary conversation of her childhood. Greta could not help herself. "You are from Hamburg?" Frau Schmidt smiled. "My grandparents were from Hamburg. They came here in 1871. I was born in this town, but my grandmother raised me on Hamburg German. She said I should never forget where we came from." She said it the way people say things that have been true their entire lives and require no particular emphasis. Then she turned and led them onto the factory floor. The building was large, modern, fitted with machinery that hummed with the confidence of equipment that was regularly maintained. Electric refrigerators lined one wall, keeping the temperature precisely controlled. Metal processing tables stretched in rows under fluorescent lights that provided the kind of even, shadowless illumination that German factories had been improvising toward for years, without quite achieving. Greta had worked in a Hamburg factory before the war. She had specific memories of that factory. The old machines that broke down routinely, the parts that were ordered and never arrived, the workarounds that accumulated over years until the workarounds had workarounds, and nobody could remember what the original procedure had been designed to do. This factory had no workarounds. Everything worked because when something stopped working, someone fixed it immediately, using parts that were simply available, kept in stock as a matter of routine. Frau Schmidt showed them their stations, cutting, trimming, packaging, and demonstrated each task with the economical precision of someone who had been doing this for 20 years and could do it correctly without using her full attention. Greta watched and learned quickly, her hands adapting to the new motions with the muscle memory of someone who had always worked with her hands and trusted them to figure out the specifics. The plant processed 2,000 hogs every week. Frau Schmidt said this as a logistical fact, the way you state the output of any operation, matter-of-factly, because the number was simply what it was and required no commentary. Greta heard it and did the arithmetic automatically. 2,000 animals a week, processed and packaged, and sent to stores where people bought it and ate it, as though meat were a thing that simply existed in sufficient quantities, because that was the nature of reality. In Hamburg, before she left for the war, her mother had stood in a queue for 3 hours to buy a piece of pork the size of a man's fist. That was in 1941, before things got worse. She had no reliable information about what queues looked like in Hamburg now, in 1943, except that every piece of information she had received suggested the answer was longer, and at the end of them, less. At the morning break, Frau Schmidt handed each woman a sausage, fresh, hot, made from the same meat moving through the factory around them. She handed them out the way you hand someone a cup of coffee, as an unremarkable courtesy, a small practical kindness, the kind of thing that cost nothing because there was plenty. Greta held hers and watched the Canadian workers take theirs. They ate them quickly, standing up, already discussing other things, their attention elsewhere. The sausage was not an event for them. It was a break-time sausage, one of many, indistinguishable from last Tuesday's break-time sausage, and unremarkable in every respect. She took a bite. Real meat, real spices. The taste of something made properly from proper ingredients by people who had not had to improvise or substitute or calculate whether the spices could be stretched another week. She ate it slowly and did not talk, and made sure her face did not show what it was doing. At lunch, Frau Schmidt sat beside her with a letter in her hand. She read it with a small frown of concentration, then folded it and looked at Greta. "From my cousin in Hamburg," she said. "She writes me when she can. The mail takes months to get here, when it gets here at all." She paused. "She says they are hungry. No meat, almost no bread. The bombing is constant now. She says entire neighborhoods are gone." Greta looked at the lunch in front of her. Bread, thick and fresh. A bowl of soup with actual vegetables in it. A piece of cheese. Coffee. "You are from Hamburg too," Frau Schmidt said. It was not a question. She had heard it in Greta's accent from the first sentence. "Yes." "Your family?" "I don't know," Greta said. "No letters for 5 months." Frau Schmidt reached across the table and put her hand over Greta's. She did not say anything immediately. She sat with the contact for a moment, the way people sit with something that has no adequate verbal response. "I pray for them," she said finally. "I pray for all of them over there." Greta looked at this woman. Same heritage, same dialect, same city in the roots of the family tree. different ocean, different outcome. Frau Schmidt's grandparents had made a decision in 1871 that put her here, in abundance, praying for cousins. Greta's grandparents had stayed, and the staying had led, through a chain of unremarkable decisions, to this table, this moment, this hand over hers. The only meaningful difference between them was which side of an ocean their families had chosen 70 years ago. Liesel had been sent to a farm. The family's name was Bauer, the same as her own last name, which made her smile for the first time in weeks when she saw it on the mailbox at the end of the long dirt driveway. The farm was 160 acres. Liesel's family farm in Bavaria was 40 acres, and people in the village called it substantial. This farm was 4 times that size, and the Bauer family did not appear to consider it remarkable. They had 2 automobiles, one for work, one for Sundays, electric milking machines in the barn, a telephone on the kitchen wall, and a radio in the living room that played music in the evenings. Mrs. Bauer was perhaps 55, with a Bavarian accent that her parents had carried across the ocean and installed in their daughter as thoroughly as any piece of furniture. She fed Liesel at the family table, the same food the family ate, and treated her with the firm, unsentimental kindness of a farm woman who assessed need practically and responded to it accordingly. On her first evening, Liesel sat at the dinner table and looked at her plate. Roast chicken, potatoes with butter, real butter, not the margarine substitute, fresh vegetables from the kitchen garden, a glass of whole milk. Mrs. Bauer watched her for a moment, then reached over and added more potatoes to her plate. "Eat," she said in German. "You are too thin. We have plenty. Plenty." The word arrived in Liesel's chest with a weight it shouldn't have had. She had not heard that word used sincerely in the context of food since before the war. After dinner, Mrs. Bauer served apple cake. Real sugar in the cake. Liesel could taste it, the clean sweetness of it, unmistakable and slightly shocking after years of saccharine substitutes. Real eggs. Real butter in the crust. The cake tasted like a specific Sunday afternoon in Bavaria in 1938 when she was 14 years old, and the war was still hypothetical, and her mother baked on Sundays because there was enough to bake with. She did not cry at the dinner table. She saved it for later, in the small room Mrs. Bauer had given her, lying in a real bed under a real quilt, where she cried quietly into the pillow for reasons she could not have fully explained, and did not try to. Magda's assignment at the hospital was different in kind from the others. She was not doing physical labor. She was sitting between people and languages, translating, taking what one person said in English and rendering it into German for another person, then taking the response back. She had done this kind of work informally her entire adult life. She had not done it in a setting like this one. The hospital was clean, well lit, equipped with instruments and medicines that represented what a hospital was supposed to have, rather than what the circumstances of a collapsing war effort allowed. Penicillin on the shelves, not rationed, not whispered about as a theoretical possibility. Just there, in the quantities that actual patient need required. X-ray machines that functioned. Surgical lights that provided real illumination. The infrastructure of medicine practiced as it was meant to be practiced, without the constant improvisation that had characterized every medical facility Magda had encountered in the previous 3 years. Her first patient was an elderly man named Mr. Fenstermacher, 81 years old, who had emigrated from Saxony in 1895 and never fully transferred his thinking into English. He lay in his hospital bed and spoke German to the American doctor with the patient persistence of someone who had been trying to communicate across this particular gap for decades and had not given up. The doctor spoke no German. He had been managing with gestures and a phrasebook that was visibly inadequate to the task of medical communication. Magda sat down between them. For the next 40 minutes, she carried the conversation back and forth. The doctor's questions rendered into the specific Saxon German of a very old man. The old man's answers translated into the clinical English the doctor needed to make correct decisions. At the end of it, the doctor had what he needed, and Mr. Fenstermacher had understood his diagnosis and his treatment plan, and the approximate timeline of his recovery. The old man looked at Magda when the doctor left. "You speak good German," he said. "Berlin, yes?" "Yes. I have not heard Berlin German in many years." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "My wife was from Berlin. She died in 1931. She would have liked to talk with you." Magda sat with him for a few minutes longer than her assignment required. She did not think of it as kindness exactly. She thought of it as the appropriate response to a human being who had said something real. That evening, she wrote in her notebook. Not figures this time. She had been writing figures since capture, and the figures had long since said everything they were going to say. She wrote words instead. The old man in room 4 is from Saxony. He has been in America for 48 years. He still thinks in German. He still dreams in German, he told me. His children speak English and understand German. His grandchildren understand a few words. His great-grandchildren know only that their great-grandfather came from somewhere far away. The language is thinning with each generation. By the time his great-grandchildren have children of their own, the German will probably be gone. And yet the old man is here. His family is here. The language carried them across an ocean, and the ocean kept them safe while the language slowly dissolved into the new one. The trade seems to have been worth it. I keep thinking about what they kept and what they left behind. They kept the food and the music and the names and the accent. They left behind the government. They left behind whoever was in charge of deciding what being German meant. I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know it was an option. The three women met in the evenings in the barracks common room. They had developed the habit of sitting together after dinner and reporting on the day. Not formally, but as an extension of the conversation they had been conducting since the farmhouse in Tunisia, the one about what was true and what wasn't. Greta told them about Frau Schmidt and her Hamburg German and the 2,000 hogs a week. Liesel told them about the farm and the apple cake and the word plenty delivered without irony. Magda told them about the old Saxon man and his thinning language and the things she had written in her notebook. Around them, the other women occupied the common room in their various states of adjustment. Some were angry, the specific, sustained anger of people whose certainties had been disturbed and who were responding by gripping the certainties harder. Some were quiet in the way of people who are waiting to see what they think before they say anything. Some were already beginning the complicated, necessary process of accepting that what they were seeing was real. They kept the food, Liesel said, returning to what Magda had written, and the music, and the language, and left behind the government. Yes, Magda said. What do we leave behind? Magda looked at her notebook for a moment. Everything that required lying to maintain, she said. The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the direction of the town, a radio was playing. An accordion waltz, slow and familiar, drifting across the summer air from a place where German music and American life had been coexisting for 70 years without apparent contradiction. Greta listened to it until it ended. Then she went to bed and thought about Hamburg, and Frau Schmidt's hand on hers, and the word plenty, and what it would mean to keep the things worth keeping and leave the rest. She did not arrive at any conclusions, but the question itself felt, for the first time, like something she was allowed to ask. September arrived with cooler air, and the smell of harvested fields drifting through the camp windows. The war in Europe continued in the abstract way that wars continue when you are not in them. Radio reports, newspaper headlines, names of places that used to mean something, and now meant only the latest front, the latest advance, the latest number that represented people. Greta listened to the reports when she could and filed what she heard in the part of her mind reserved for things she could not act on. Her days at Schneider Meats had developed a rhythm. She arrived in the morning with Corporal Henderson, who continued to deploy his fragmentary German with the same cheerful confidence, worked through the shift with Frau Schmidt, ate lunch at the long table in the break room, and returned to camp in the late afternoon. The work was physical and repetitive, and required exactly enough attention to prevent the mind from wandering too far, in directions that led nowhere useful. She had begun to value that quality in work. Frau Schmidt had become something that wasn't friendship, but was its structural precursor. A daily presence, a reliable source of honest information, a woman who asked questions and listened to the answers, and did not perform either kindness or distance. She brought letters from her Hamburg cousin most weeks. The letters described a city that was disappearing block by block, under a bombardment that had moved from occasional to constant. Frau Schmidt read them with the steady grief of someone who had learned to hold bad news without being destroyed by it. She shared them with Greta because Greta was from Hamburg, and therefore the information belonged to her too. My cousin writes that the Blumenvoss shipyards were hit again, Frau Schmidt said one afternoon. That is near where I grew up, Greta said. I know. I looked it up on the map. She folded the letter and put it away. I pray for your mother every night, she said. I have been since you told me about her. Greta looked at her hands on the cutting table. She had received no letters from home in 7 months. 7 months was long enough to encompass many outcomes, most of which she did not allow herself to examine directly during working hours, because working hours required functional attention, and functional attention required not examining those outcomes. Thank you, she said. Frau Schmidt nodded, and they returned to work. And nothing more was said. And it was enough. Liesel had settled into the Bauer farm with the adaptability of someone who had grown up doing physical work, and found that physical work was more or less the same, regardless of which country's soil you were standing on. The crops needed tending. The animals needed feeding. The barn needed cleaning. These facts were geographically neutral. Mr. Bauer was a man of few words and consistent fairness, a combination Liesel had encountered rarely and valued immediately. He showed her what needed doing, watched her do it, corrected what needed correcting, and thereafter treated her work as reliable. He did not discuss the war. He did not discuss politics. He discussed weather, soil conditions, the health of the animals, and the equipment. Practical things that existed outside the categories of enemy and ally, and simply required attention. His 3 sons were overseas with the American Army. This fact was present in the house the way large facts are present. Not discussed constantly but structurally there, informing the silence at the dinner table, and the way Mrs. Bauer paused sometimes when the radio mentioned a particular region of Europe. Liesel understood that silence with the full-body comprehension of someone whose own brother was somewhere in Russia. Unreachable, present only in the same structural way. One evening after dinner, Mrs. Bauer brought out a photograph album. She opened it on the kitchen table and turned it toward Liesel. Old photographs, sepia and formal. Men and women in the clothing of another century, standing in front of buildings that looked German because they were German. My parents, Mrs. Bauer said in her Bavarian German. And their parents. This is the village they came from. She pointed to a photograph of a church surrounded by alpine meadow. I know that church, Liesel said. Mrs. Bauer looked at her. It is 20 kilometers from my village. They sat with that for a moment. The same church, 20 kilometers from where Liesel grew up, photographed by Mrs. Bauer's grandparents before they left, carried across the ocean in an album, sitting now on a kitchen table in Indiana, while the country in the photograph bombed itself into rubble. Do you think it is still standing? Mrs. Bauer asked. The church? I think so. That part of Bavaria has not been... Liesel paused. Not yet badly hit. Not yet, Mrs. Bauer repeated. She closed the album carefully. I hope it stands, she said. It was very beautiful. Magda's work at the hospital had expanded. The doctor she translated for most frequently was a man named Dr. Heinrich Weiss, a name that carried its own geography. His grandparents from Württemberg, his parents American-born, himself entirely American in manner and training, while carrying the family name like a piece of luggage he had long since stopped noticing. He was 40, precise, interested in everything. The kind of doctor who asked questions beyond the immediate clinical picture, because he understood that patients were systems rather than collections of symptoms. He spoke no German but was learning, he told Magda, because the town had a significant elderly German-speaking population, and he was tired of not being able to communicate directly. He asked her questions during the slower moments of the day. Not about the war, not about Germany, not about anything that touched the official categories of their relationship. He asked about the language, specific words, grammatical structures, the differences between regional dialects that Magda could explain, because she had studied linguistics as part of her university education. Why does the old Saxon man use different words than you do? He asked one afternoon. Regional dialect, Magda said. Germany is not linguistically uniform. Every region has its own vocabulary and pronunciation. A person from Hamburg sounds different from a person from Bavaria. A person from Saxony sounds different from both. Like American accents, Dr. Weiss said. Something like that, but more extreme. In some cases, the dialects are different enough that speakers have difficulty understanding each other. He thought about this. So when people say German, they mean many different things, Magda said, held together by a written standard that everyone agrees on. and a government that told everyone what being German meant. It was not a question. Magda looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Until recently." The announcement came on a Wednesday morning, posted on the board outside the camp administration building. Magda read it first, then found Greta and Liesel, and brought them back to read it themselves, because some things required verification before they could be processed. The posting announced that the local German-American community would hold an Oktoberfest celebration on the 24th of September. In recognition of the cultural connections between the town's German heritage residents and their German prisoners, the camp commander had approved supervised attendance. All 847 women were invited. "A party," Liesel said. "An Oktoberfest," Magda said. "They are inviting us to an Oktoberfest." "Yes." Liesel read the posting a second time. "For prisoners." Apparently, the barracks divided on the question along the lines that had been forming since capture. Some women refused immediately. It was propaganda, a performance designed to weaken their resistance, a trick whose purpose they could not yet see but were certain existed. An older woman named Hilda, who had maintained the most rigid military bearing of anyone in the camp, said flatly that attending would be a betrayal of their duty, and she would not participate. Others were going regardless. Greta had decided before she finished reading the posting. She had not attended anything resembling a celebration in 2 years. She had not smelled German cooking in longer than that. Whatever the Americans' purpose was, her purpose was simple: to sit in a room where those smells existed and remain in it for as long as they allowed. September 24th arrived clear and cool. The trucks took them into town in the early evening, the light going golden over the flat fields, the town's grain elevator catching the last of the sun and holding it briefly before letting it go. The Concordia Club was a large brick building on Friedrich Street, its windows lit from inside, German folk art painted along the upper facade in colors that had faded gracefully with the decades. Greta stepped through the door and stopped. The smell hit her like a physical thing. Schnitzel frying in real butter, sauerkraut cooking with bacon, potato dumplings in a pot of boiling water releasing their particular starchy steam, apple strudel in the oven, the cinnamon and pastry smell drifting out from the kitchen and filling the entire hall. She stood in the doorway and did not move for a moment. Behind her, Liesel made a sound that was not a word. Around them, women were stopping, their momentum arrested by the same sensory ambush, their faces doing things that had nothing to do with the present moment and everything to do with kitchens that no longer existed in the forms they remembered. The hall held perhaps 300 people. German-American civilians in their good clothes, older couples, middle-aged women whose husbands or sons were overseas, young women in dresses that showed the care taken before an occasion worth dressing for. A band was setting up in the corner, accordion, violin, drums, the instrumentation of a tradition that had crossed an ocean intact and continued on the other side, as if the crossing were a detail rather than a transformation. The food was laid out on long tables along one wall. Greta moved toward it slowly, not rushing, taking it in as a whole before approaching any individual part. Platters of schnitzel, golden and hot. Bowls of red cabbage, cooked with apples. The sweet sour smell of it unmistakable. Potato dumplings with butter pooling in the indentations on their surface. Rye bread sliced thick. And at the end of the table an apple strudel, golden brown, dusted with powdered sugar, its pastry layers visible at the cut end, where someone had already served a portion. Real food. German food. Food that existed not because it was necessary, but because someone had decided to make it carefully, with proper ingredients, for the pleasure of the people who would eat it. Greta had forgotten that food could be made for pleasure. She had not forgotten it intellectually. She knew it had once been true, but she had forgotten it in the body, in the way you forget warmth when you have been cold long enough. She took a plate. She served herself schnitzel and dumplings and red cabbage and a slice of rye bread. She carried it to a table and sat down and looked at it for a moment before she began to eat. It tasted like Hamburg. It tasted like Sunday. It tasted like before. Across the hall, an elderly man was making his way toward her table. He was perhaps 70, white-haired, moving carefully with a walking stick. He stopped in front of her and spoke. Not standard German. Plattdeutsch. Low German, the dialect of the northern coastal regions. The dialect of Hamburg specifically. The dialect Greta's grandmother had spoken, and her father had used with old friends, and that she had not heard from outside her own family since she was a child. "You remind me of my granddaughter," he said in the language of her childhood. "She lives in Hamburg. Is your family from there?" Greta set down her fork. "Yes," she said. "Hamburg. My family is there." His eyes filled. "My granddaughter is 16. We used to write letters before the war made the mail unreliable. I have not heard from her in 14 months. He paused. "Do you know what it is like there now? Is it—" He could not finish the sentence. Greta could not finish it either. She knew what Hamburg was like now in the way you know something that you have received as information, but have not seen, incompletely, through the gap between data and reality, aware that the data is inadequate. The city was being bombed continuously. Entire neighborhoods were gone. Her mother had not written in 7 months. She told him what she knew. She said it plainly, without softening it, because he deserved honesty and because pretending would have been an insult to the old man standing in front of her with tears on his face, crying for a 16-year-old girl in a burning city. When she finished, they stood together in silence for a moment. Two people from Hamburg, separated by an ocean and a war and 70 years of diverging history, standing in an Indiana hall that smelled like the city they both came from, crying for people they could not reach. "I pray for her every night," the old man said finally. "So do I," Greta said, though she had never met his granddaughter and never would. "For all of them." He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, then moved away, and she sat back down at her table and looked at her plate, and did not eat for a while. Across the room, Liesl was sitting with a young American woman about her own age. Greta could see them from where she sat, the two of them leaning slightly toward each other in the posture of people exchanging something real. The young woman was twisting a handkerchief. Liesl's hands were still. Later, Liesl would tell her what passed between them. The American woman's parents were from Bavaria, near Munich. Her brother was in Italy with the American army. She waited for letters every day. She had not heard from him in 6 weeks. Liesl's brother was in Russia with the Wehrmacht. She had not heard from him in 9 months. They had held hands. Two young women from opposite sides of the same terrible arithmetic, holding hands over the gap. The band began to play. Traditional German folk songs. Songs about mountains and rivers and the specific homesickness of people far from the places that formed them. Every woman in the room knew these songs. The German Americans knew them because their grandparents had carried them across the ocean, as carefully as any physical possession. The German prisoners knew them because they had learned them as children in the country the songs described. Magda stood against the wall and watched all of it. She watched German Americans singing German songs with American accents. She watched them laughing and celebrating a culture that was, at this moment, destroying itself on the other side of the ocean. She watched them hold both things simultaneously. The love of the heritage and the rejection of what the heritage had become, without apparent contradiction. She had been told her entire life that these two things were inseparable. She was watching, with her own eyes, 847 pieces of evidence that they were not. The ride back to camp was silent. 847 women in covered trucks, moving through the dark Indiana countryside, nobody speaking. The accordion still audible for the first minute after the trucks pulled away and then gone, replaced by the engine noise and the sound of the road. Greta sat with her hands in her lap and looked at nothing. The schnitzel smell was still in her clothes. She thought it might stay there for days and found she did not mind. Back in the barracks, the silence broke. Not gradually, all at once. Like a pressure that had been building since the moment they walked through the Concordia Club door and had reached the limit of what silence could contain. Some women cried, some argued. A woman named Hilda, who had refused to attend, stood in the doorway of the common room and told the ones who had gone that they had shamed themselves and Germany both. A younger woman told Hilda that Germany was currently doing an adequate job of shaming itself without any assistance. The argument that followed was loud and circular and ended not with resolution, but with exhaustion. Greta sat on her bunk and let it move around her. She had nothing to add to any of it. She was still in the Concordia Club, still sitting across from the old man with the Hamburg accent and the 16-year-old granddaughter he had not heard from in 14 months, still feeling the specific weight of that conversation, the way it had taken everything she had been carrying alone and briefly made it shared. She had not expected to find that here. She had not expected to find anything here except the working out of whatever the propaganda had been wrong about. What she had found was more complicated and less categorizable than that. Magda came and sat beside her without speaking. She had her notebook open but was not writing. She was looking at the wall with the expression she used when she was at the end of a long chain of reasoning and had arrived somewhere she had not anticipated. "Say it," Greta said. Magda looked at her. "You can be German without being what Germany became," she said. "Those people proved it. They have been proving it for 70 years. They kept every part of being German that was worth keeping, and they left behind everything that required cruelty to maintain." She paused. "We never had that choice. They made the choice for us before we were born. They decided what being German meant, and they built walls around the definition, so nobody could question it. But it was always a choice," Greta said. "Yes," Magda said. "It was always a choice. We just weren't allowed to know that." October came. The work continued, the factory, the farm, the hospital, and the days accumulated with the quiet persistence of days that are not dramatic, but are doing something to you nonetheless. The way water does something to stone. At Schneider Meats, Frau Schmidt brought Greta a package one morning. Inside was a letter, opened and resealed with the tape that indicated American censors had read it. And beneath the letter, wrapped in cloth, a small photograph. The letter was from Frau Schmidt's Hamburg cousin. It mentioned in the careful language of someone writing under wartime conditions, a woman named Ilse Hoffmann, who had survived the July firebombing and was living with relatives in the eastern part of the city. Ilse Hoffmann was Greta's mother's name. She read the sentence 3 times. She read it a 4th time to make sure the name was specific and not a coincidence of a common surname. The letter mentioned the street, a street Greta knew, 2 blocks from where her mother's sister lived. Frau Schmidt watched her read it. She said nothing. She simply waited with the patience of someone who understood that there are moments that require witness rather than response. When Greta finally looked up, her eyes were doing something she could not stop, and she did not try to stop it. "She is alive," she said. "She is alive," Frau Schmidt agreed. That evening Greta wrote a letter. She wrote it knowing the censors would read it, knowing it would take months to arrive, knowing there was no guarantee it would reach its destination, given what was happening to Hamburg's postal infrastructure. She wrote it anyway. "Dear Mama," she wrote, "I am in America. I am a prisoner, but I am treated well. I eat enough. I am healthy. I work in a factory with a woman whose grandparents came from Hamburg, and who speaks our dialect and has kind hands. I think about you every day. I hope you are eating. I hope the building is holding. I have learned things here that I will need time to explain when I see you. Things about what is possible. Things I did not know were true. Please survive until I can come home and tell you." Liesel spent her last weeks on the Bauer farm learning to operate the electric milking machines. Mr. Bauer taught her with the same economy he brought to all instruction. Show once, watch once, correct if necessary, then trust. She became competent quickly. She had always been competent quickly at physical things. On her last day, Mrs. Bauer made apple cake. The same recipe, the same ingredients, the same smell coming from the kitchen that had undone Liesel on her first evening. She had been on the farm for 4 months. She had learned to accept one of the factory, where Greta stood in her work apron next to Frau Schmidt with their arms at their sides, unsmiling. The serious expressions of a formal photograph that still managed to contain something warm. She packed a small notebook in which she had recorded, over 4 months, observations she did not want to lose. Liesel packed the recipe. She packed the photograph album page that Mrs. Bauer had carefully detached and given her. The photograph of the Bavarian church, 20 kilometers from her village, the building that might still be standing. She packed a letter from Mrs. Bauer addressed to Liesel's mother, introducing herself as a woman whose parents had come from the same region of Bavaria, expressing the hope that they might correspond after the war when the mail worked again. "Give it to her yourself," Mrs. Bauer had said, "but take it in case." Magda packed the reference letter. She packed her notebook, 4 months of observations that she intended to spend the rest of her life thinking about. She packed a German-English dictionary that Dr. Weiss had given her, inscribed on the inside cover in his precise handwriting, "For the work of rebuilding, which requires all the languages you have." The morning of departure was gray and cold. Corporal Henderson drove the first truck, as he had driven most of their transports, and spent the ride to the train station teaching Liesel the English words for the things they passed. "Field," he said, pointing. "Feld," she said in German. "Same word," he said, surprised. "Many of them are," she said. "We come from the same place, far back enough." He thought about this for the rest of the drive and did not say anything else, but she could see him turning it over. The train to New York took 2 days. Greta watched America move past the window in reverse. The Midwest giving way to the east. The flat fields replaced by hills. The hills by the density of the approaching coast. She had arrived not knowing what to look for. She was leaving knowing what she had found, which was not what she expected. She had expected evidence that the propaganda was wrong. She had found something larger. Evidence that the life she had been living was constructed on choices that had been made for her before she was born, and presented as the only possible configuration of reality. The German Americans of that Indiana town had made different choices 70 years earlier, and the difference was visible in everything. In the food on their tables, in the safety of their streets, in the casual abundance of a country that had not spent itself into ruin, chasing a vision of greatness that required other people's destruction to maintain. The ship left New York on a gray November morning. Greta stood at the rail as the city receded. The skyline unbombed, whole, its lights still on in the early morning. A city that had no experience of being the target of what it was capable of producing. She stood there until the coastline was a line and then a suggestion, and then gone. The Atlantic crossing took 12 days. On the 9th day, the radio brought news from Nuremberg. Sentences handed down, names read out, the formal accounting of what had been done in the name of the country she was returning to. She listened to the names and recognized some of them. She had seen those names on documents. She had processed paperwork that bore their authority. She stood on the deck afterward in the cold air and looked at the water and let that be true without trying to manage what it meant. Germany appeared on a cold December morning. Bremerhaven Harbor, half rebuilt, the evidence of damage visible alongside the evidence of repair. A country in the early, unglamorous stage of becoming something after having been destroyed. British soldiers at the dock with clipboards. Long queues. People who looked like the war had lived inside them for years and had only recently begun to move out, leaving the damage behind. Greta walked down the gangway with her 20 kilograms and joined the queue. Ahead of her, Liesel walked with the recipe folded in her coat pocket and the photograph of the Bavarian church held carefully in her hand, as if it might blow away. Behind her, Magda walked with the notebook under her arm and the reference letter in the inside pocket of her jacket. The processing officer asked Greta the standard questions. Name, rank, unit, duration of captivity. He asked about her treatment. She told him the truth, that she had been treated well, fed properly, allowed to work, given access to her language and her culture. Hope the building is holding. I have learned things here that I will need time to explain when I see you. Things about what is possible. Things I did not know were true. Please survive until I can come home and tell you. Liesel spent her last weeks on the Bauer farm learning to operate the electric milking machines. Mr. Bauer taught her with the same economy he brought to all instruction. Show once, watch once, correct if necessary, then trust. She became competent quickly. She had always been competent quickly at physical things. On her last day, Mrs. Bauer made apple cake. The same recipe, the same ingredients, the same smell coming from the kitchen that had undone Liesel on her first evening. She had been on the farm for 4 months. She had learned to accept the food without the complicated grief of the early weeks, not because the grief had disappeared, but because she had found a place to put it that did not require carrying it at mealtimes. Mrs. Bauer cut a large slice and set it in front of her. Then she sat down across the table and folded her hands and looked at Liesel with the direct, unsentimental attention of a woman who said what she meant and meant what she said. "You are a good worker," she said. "My sons would have liked you." Liesel looked at the cake. "I hope your sons come home," she said. "I hope your brother comes home," Mrs. Bauer said. They looked at each other across the table. 2 women from the same region of the world, separated by 70 years of a decision one family made and the other didn't, hoping the same thing in 2 different directions across the same war. "When you go back," Mrs. Bauer said, "take the recipe." She slid a folded piece of paper across the table. The apple cake recipe, written in Mrs. Bauer's handwriting, in Bavarian German, with the particular annotations of someone who had been making the same cake for 40 years and knew which steps required emphasis. "Your mother will want it," Mrs. Bauer said. "Good recipes survive everything." Magda's last days at the hospital were spent in a conversation that extended across multiple shifts, conducted in the pauses between patients whenever Dr. Weiss had a question, and she had an answer. They had moved, gradually and without either of them formally deciding to, from language lessons to something more like genuine inquiry. Two educated people from different sides of a war, using the space of a working day to think out loud in each other's presence. "What will you do when you go home?" he asked one afternoon. "I don't know what home is anymore," Magda said. "Berlin? Berlin is occupied. Or it will be. The part I knew is probably rubble." She paused. "I will go back to Germany. I will find what is left. I will try to be useful. Using what you know. Using what I know." Dr. Weiss was quiet for a moment. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a folded letter. He had written it in advance, she understood. Had prepared it knowing this conversation would come. It was a letter of professional reference, typed on hospital stationery, signed and stamped, describing her qualifications as a translator and medical interpreter, and recommending her for any position requiring those skills. "It won't mean much in Germany right now," he said, "but keep it. Eventually things will be rebuilt, and references will matter again." Magda took the letter. She looked at it for a moment. An American doctor vouching for a German prisoner on paper that would survive the war and whatever came after. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He considered the question seriously, which she had learned was his way. "Because you're good at the work," he said, "and because the people who will rebuild Germany should be people who know what kindness looks like from the outside." "You think I will rebuild Germany?" "I think someone will have to," he said. "Might as well be someone who's been paying attention." The departure orders came in November. Processing, transport, a ship from New York, Germany by December. The camp organized itself around the logistics of leaving with the same impersonal efficiency that had organized everything else, and the women packed their 20 kilograms with the careful selectivity of people who had learned that what you chose to carry. Magda was going to Berlin. Greta was going to Hamburg. They had said most of what needed saying already, over 4 months of evenings in the barracks common room, in the incremental honesty of people processing something large together. They stood on the platform in the December cold. "Write to me," Liesl said. "Write to me," Magda said. "I will," Greta said. "Both of you." She looked at them. Liesl, who had arrived in Tunisia at 19, wanting only to help Germany win and go home to her parents, and was leaving this at 20 knowing that home was more complicated than a place on a map. And Magda, who had known for years that something was wrong and had finally, in an Indiana town where German grandmothers raised American grandchildren, found the language to say what it was. The train came. They picked up their bags. Liesl went first, then Magda. Greta watched them board, then picked up her own bag and walked to her car. Through the window as the train pulled out, she watched Germany move past in the gray December light. Damaged, cold, occupied, beginning the long and difficult work of becoming something that did not require lying to sustain itself. She had come back with 20 kilograms of possessions and something that weighed nothing and could not be taken at the border. She knew what kindness looked like when it had no agenda. She knew what abundance felt like when it was the baseline rather than the reward. She knew that you could carry a language and a culture and a way of cooking apples across an ocean and build something decent with it on the other side and leave behind every part that required cruelty to maintain. She knew it was possible because she had seen it, smelled it, eaten it, worked beside it every day for 4 months. The train moved north toward Hamburg. Her mother was alive. The city was damaged but present. The work of returning was just beginning. She held the letter in her jacket pocket and looked out the window at the country she had fought for, and was now coming back to as someone who knew for the first time what it could have been, what it still could be. If the people coming home from places like she had been